Welcome to Rocking Our Prize. I'm here with Dr. Oliver Kim, who has just completed his PhD at Berkeley and recently appointed at Open Phil. He does awesome research on the structural determinants of growth. Oliver, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Alice.
And congratulations on your PhD. This is terrific.
Thank you.
Okay, now, I have 5 questions for you. And the first one, I guess, is a bit challenging, but I want you to just take your time and take us through it. Why do you think East Asia is the only world region to have converged with the West? And what I'd really like you to do is, we all know there are a bunch of important factors. Can you give me a ranking and explain why you're ranking them in that way? I'd really appreciate that. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, so you started off with a doozy here. So the first thing I'll state is that I'm mostly an East Asia specialist. I have some knowledge of East Africa. I'm not, a comparativist, so I hope you set me straight, especially if I say anything wrong about Latin America or the Middle East. I'll just point out 3 sort of broad buckets of factors. I'll not rank them at the start. Maybe at the end I'll rank them. But 3 sort of major categories that I think can structure this answer to this enormous question. I guess the first bucket is the sort of historical institutional legacies that made East Asia kind of unique. The second are sort of modern economic policies that occurred, I guess, after independence in the second half of the 20th century. And then the third sort of broad bucket of factors is just the global macro environment. So things that are kind of a little bit outside of the individual control of the country, but shape the context, I guess, in which East Asia developed. So none of these are mutually exclusive. They interact in very interesting ways, but the causality goes in all sorts of different directions. But I think, this is one way of kind of
hold you up there, that I hear no bucket on culture and no bucket on geography. Is that right?
I would put culture under the sort of historical institutional legacies. Okay, maybe you could call it culture and institutions. So you'll give me a little bit of culture. Yeah. All right. Yeah.
But geography doesn't get into your buckets.
Geography, if you mean things like geopolitics, I think that would filter in as well. And it would also shape the sort of factoral endowments, basically, of these countries. And so that's, I think, the way that it enters.
I'll stop interrupting. You go with your buckets.
Okay, so the first big bucket, I think, to sort of set the stage is the historical sort of legacy and the institutional legacy that East Asia had. And to set the stage a little bit, something I've been thinking about a lot is sometimes when you'll read this literature on East Asian development, you'll often see this factoid that around 1950 or 1960, around the time when African countries were becoming independent, when after the Korean War and the beginnings of the Cold War, South Korea and Taiwan had roughly the same GDP per capita as Kenya or Zaire or other sort of recently independent African countries. And I think this factoid is usually given and is stated for several reasons. One motivation, I think, is to emphasize, I guess, the tremendous GDP growth that occurred in the latter half of the 20th century. But then another is also maybe to emphasize that miraculous change is possible. Countries do, to have some extent, have control of their economic destinies, and it's possible basically to take within the lifetime of a single person, to move a country from poverty to prosperity. But I think there's a lot of ways that this sort of very crude GDP comparison is just very misleading. To use a phrase that's used a lot these days, countries don't just fall out of coconut trees. They exist in the context that came before. So, in the first case, there's this tremendous institutional legacy differences, basically, in particular between East Asia and Africa. So, in Korea's case, there was several thousand years of continuous history. In a lot of ways, the sort of nation states of Korea, Japan, maybe to a lesser extent China, these states formed well before their European counterparts. And so there's this long sort of history of continuous civilization and state sort of forms of government centered around a state. That's fairly unique in a global sense. In Taiwan, there were several hundred years of Han-Chinese colonization. And then more proximate, I guess, to the economic takeoff, there was a period in both Korea and Taiwan's case of Japanese colonial rule.
Wait, I'm going to hold you up. Are you not going to add more on the institutional stuff? Just continuous states?
No, that's the first part of the answer.
Okay, but go into more detail on that. I would add a lot on the institutional legacy. May I
Yeah.
interject,
Please,
and you
please
can tell
interject.
me if you're
Yes.
wrong?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think one really important set of reforms across East Asia were the imperial examinations. So Yasheng Huang, who was previously on my podcast with his wonderful book, The Rise and Fall of the East, he highlights that Empress Wu Zetian in the 7th century in China introduced these meritocratic reforms to reduce the power of the aristocracy. And there's a wonderful new paper that actually just came out that showed that actually during the Tang, it was very meritocratic, and you had to pass these imperial examinations. And there's this wonderful book called The Ladder of Mobility. So there were all these stories and fables and myths about, the commoner's son, the peasant's son, the trader's son, and the idea that if you educated your son, then he could achieve great riches. He would have become a high-ranking official, a noble, and all these stories were about, this the opiate of the masses, and everyone believed it. And of course, after the Silla Kingdom in Korea, the Joseon dynasty also incorporated this same imperial examinations. Now, many people are critical of Confucianism, and they say, well, it indoctrinated rote learning, etc., and deference to authorities and unquestioned obedience and patriarchy. But I think a really important aspect is that it instilled this belief in many parents that upward mobility is possible, and upward mobility is achievable through massively investing in education. So if you compare it to many Islamic caliphates where they didn't have that strong reverence for social mobility, certainly if you compare it to many Hindu societies where a Dalit's grandson is always going to be Dalit, impure and polluting, whereas the Brahmin is, pure, etc. So East Asian societies were unique for having this strong reverence for education and this belief that anyone could achieve social mobility. Now, of course, under the Chinese systems, which spread throughout East Asia, there was a ranking, there was a hierarchy, and they scorned upon traders and merchants while the literati were esteemed. But they still had this fundamental idea that upward mobility was brilliant and achievable through education. And I think that tracks. There's a wonderful book called Education Fever in South Korea, all about people really investing in education. And Danny Roderick has a paper in 1995 showing that relative to other civilizations, relative to other societies, compared for similar GDP per capita, Koreans, Taiwanese, super educated. I think that reflects a cultural belief that education is the pathway to the top. So that's my little addition.
Yeah, no, I think it's great that you brought up the Roderick paper because that's exactly kind of, I think, what I had in mind. And it's, I hadn't thought as closely, I guess, about the linkage to the cultural side in terms of the educational attainment stuff. I think often that's attributed to, in a large part, I guess, Japanese colonial investments that occurred in the first half of the 20th century, where you had a form of settler colonialism, basically, where there was, I mean, it wasn't like in large parts of West Africa or even like East Africa where, the colonial presence, the British or the French come, they put up a flag, they send in like several hundred administrators, they recruit a bunch of native troops, and then they don't really do anything, right? The Japanese settled in large places, they took a very active role in changing the societies, and one of the things they did was they invested heavily in education, built schools. I am very sympathetic to the argument that there are these longer running cultural sort of factors. The paper that really comes to mind, I think, is David Young's paper actually on the sort of aftermath of the Cultural Revolution. So they have these like social tables from pre-revolutionary China, and basically they find, I mean, the communist period in China has to be like one of the most, I guess, sweeping, total totalitarian kind of transformation, I guess, of a society that basically completely levels out the income distribution. And yet, in the present day, basically, you see a lot of these sort of these class distinctions reassert themselves. And people who were previously like elites, in a lot of cases, this would have been tied basically to your educational status, as you mentioned. People who were previously elites kind of reemerge. And there's just basically no way that it could have been like, capital or money squirreled away. And so that signals that there's something about either like skills or values or I guess cultural sort of characteristics that are passed down from generation to generation that that kind of reassert themselves. So that at a micro level, I think is pointing at the importance, I guess, of some of these cultural factors and valuing education and all this kind of stuff.
Can we just go back to Japanese colonialism? Because I
Yeah,
appreciate that that's a sensitive subject. And I appreciate the Japanese, for example, invested in primary education specifically.
yeah,
And also there's this idea of cross-country learning, forging stronger ties. And, that comes up later, what with flying geese or both Japan and Korea deciding to do shy balls, for example. But do you think that Japanese colonialism benefited South Korea?
yeah. This is the touchiest subject of all. I think the cross country comparison with Taiwan is very helpful here, and this is where kind of history becomes very political. In Taiwan, the Japanese colonial period, and I think that this helps set up the sort of comparison here. The Japanese colonial period is remembered with quite a high degree of nostalgia. I think part of that is because the following regime, the nationalists who came in and essentially set up this mainlander government, was also viewed as a colonial regime, not as like liberators, but as a carpetbagging regime of mainlanders who came in that was in many ways more repressive, basically, than the Japanese colonial regime that had preceded it. And so in the Taiwanese case, in that academic literature, there's been a lot more sort of exploration, basically, of the role of Japanese colonial investments in terms of the cadastral surveys they did in agriculture, the investments they made in agriculture, and the investments they made to a more limited degree, I guess, in human capital and what you mentioned, like primary schooling, just general sort of stuff that we think of as being good for development. And I think that there's less of a literature that in Korea, in part because it's just so politically sensitive. Like you don't want to be the Korean academic who says that Japan was great. But I have a feeling that the experience was maybe more analogous than I think. I guess like the popular rhetoric would have it play out. Like, let's not forget that this was an incredibly politically repressive period. This was not a fun time to be a Korean under Japanese rule. There were attempts essentially to remake the culture, to sort of eradicate Korean culture as like a separate sort of entity, and that has to be sort of included in the sort of broader bucket of things. But it is true that like I think modern economic growth, as we think of it, basically the first roots of it and the sort of first evidence that you see of it started to begin basically under Japanese colonial rule of Korea.
I think let me highlight two things. There's a nice paper that came out, and they use Japanese sugar railways as an exogenous shock, and then find that Taiwanese women unbound their feet so that they could maximize their income in this new labor stream. So certainly, well, at least on that part. So you see that state technologies for government, state technologies for rule, alongside brutal repression, humiliation. Like previously, you and I were talking about the film Pachinko, and the book Pachinko, which details some of those hardships as well. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so so that's the institutional stuff. Now move me on to your next bucket, please.
Okay. Yeah. Let me quickly just
please
say one last thing on the institutional side. I think when you want to make, for instance, like the East Asia to Sub-Saharan Africa comparison, I think this is really where you want to locate a lot of the sort of explanatory difference. Which is basically, in most of Africa, basically the states were created from whole cloth, right? Like a lot of these sort of colonial boundaries. Actually, there's more recent work, I think, contradicting this a little bit, that some of these colonial boundaries reflected pre-existing geographic conditions, pre-existing sort of tribal groups, ethnic groups. But broadly speaking, a lot of these countries were essentially colonial inventions. And you had a bunch of people and ethnic groups that were lumped together that essentially had very little to do with each other. And I think that basically really hamstrung the state building project from the start. It's very different, basically, trying to implement these very risky pro-growth policies when you have a sort of fractious sort of ethnic makeup of your country, where people are competing for resources, where there's all these demands for rent seeking. And East Asia basically didn't have to deal with that. And so even if you
so let me just add on that. So I think that's a really important point, that where you have a long history of state building, and let's perhaps reframe that, a long history of nation building, right? Mm-hmm. So that's a critical difference. Like if we look at the genetic data, if we look at any kind of cultural ties, like Korea is a highly homogenous population. Like current rates of immigration are like 4%, right? Han Chinese also very, very dominant. And there were also strong incentives to buy into the Confucian system. Like going back to those imperial examinations, everybody had to study Confucius texts if you wanted your son to have a position in the esteemed bureaucracy. And like in Korea, I read that, the aristocratic family could only stay aristocratic if someone within your family had passed those exams within 3 generations and they stored the crimson certificate, right? So if everyone is going into Confucianism, that is an incredibly powerful homogenizing cultural tool. So everyone understands Confucianism, everyone understands filial piety, everyone plays by the same rule book. That is, and people don't like to say this today because we like all good things to be good, but this coercive apparatus of homogenization that maybe James Scott wouldn't like actually creates a much more homogenous society, which has got some, which mediates the process of development.
Mm-hmm. I will also say, since we're on the cultural topic,
Yes.
I was just reading, because I think it's fun. There's this book by Mary Wright, on the Tongzhi Restoration. She was a sinologist, I think, from the late 50s, early 60s. And there's the statement in there that that basically a modern sort of state it's not compatible basically with a Confucian society. And her point of view is, writing in the late 1950s, you've just seen, in some sense, the collapse of nationalist China. Chiang Kai-shek's regime doesn't appear to be doing particularly well. You've seen, basically a half century of total chaos, or actually a full century of total chaos on the Chinese mainland. And I think, I don't know, there's a sense in which I think a lot of our views about this stuff are sometimes more malleable. Within 30 years, you have Lee Kuan Yew saying exactly the opposite, which is that, having a Confucian society basically is actually great for growth and enabled this massive catch up. So I think there's some sense in which here we should be careful, I guess, of our existing kind of question what sort of vantage point we're looking at this stuff and thinking about basically, to the extent that this potentially reflects some cultural biases we may have. So that's not to completely invalidate basically the cultural arguments, but I think that there's a lot of fluidity, I think, in some of these definitions.
I think that's absolutely true. And I think that different elements of culture can be invigorated by different
Yeah.
entrepreneurs, right? So people might really play on things like, for example, the Chinese government might ham up filial piety, that you should take care of your parents to make up for a week's social security net and threadbare pensions, for example, right? So all these things are malleable and can be molded, and different dimensions of Confucianism, like sense of obedience, might, South Koreans today don't have that idea of obedience to the emperor. It's, one of the most democratic countries in the world, but you still have quite a strong idea of filial piety. So different parts can be moved around. I agree.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the right way to think about this stuff is all this stuff is dynamic. It's all moving together. And it's I think there was an older view that is kind of set and forget. You have institutions at the start, you have culture at the start, and it's static, and then you can kind of like a billiard ball set in motion. You move one ball and then you watch the sort of neat reaction of the others. No, it's much more organic, and things react. And that doesn't lend itself in a lot of ways to how we do economics and do causal inference and that kind of stuff. But descriptively, I think that's the correct way of thinking about things.
So let me push back. I would say that every single society has a broad range of different people within it, right? So within South Korea, for example, you'll have some very strong conservatives and much more progressive voices. And, we see that especially, at the moment with, feminists pushing against the recent deep fake porns and conservatives hating feminists. That's just one example of heterogeneity. But if we take a step back and compare East Asia to many other places, then we do see these strong ideas of filial piety, this very strong reverence for education, and, quite a lot of homogeneity compared to more ethnically diverse populations. So I guess that's my only point.
Yeah, I think that's fair. We don't just fall out of coconut trees.
Okay, right, back to you.
Okay, yeah, so that's the institutional point. I think, that's what separates East Asia from Sub-Saharan Africa. A lot of Sub-Saharan African states have been mired in interstate and intrastate violence. And even if you take a very minimal view of what a state should be doing to promote development, like you take a Night Watchman state view and Adam Smith view that all you need is peace easy taxes, tolerable administration of justice, you know, a lot of developing countries don't actually meet those criteria, and East Asia very clearly did, at least after the 1950s. Okay, so that's the institutional side. The second broad bucket of
Oh,
factors.
can I ask you a
Oh,
little
yeah,
question? Have you read Julia Strauss's book on land reform?
No, I
So
haven't.
she makes this argument that of China and more broadly, that one really important part of land reform was actually building up state capacity and basically penetrating all those rural areas. Like she sees this as a key moment of institution building.
Yeah, I'll get into that, because the
Okay,
first
sorry,
policy
sorry.
I think that I was going to mention was
Sorry.
land
Sorry.
reform. Yeah,
Okay.
so the second big bucket of factors are policy decisions that occurred. Let's call it like after independence in the mid 1950s, and the first big one that everyone thinks of is land reform, right? So basically, all of the you know, the East Asian tigers had, at least the non-city state ones, had some form of major land reform in the 1950s. So I think Japan's occurred like in 1949 or something like that. South Korea's, I think, was also in the late 40s. Or sorry, no, Japan I think was in 1947. Korea was in like 1948 or 9, and then Taiwan had I think the largest reaching one from the 1950s to the 1960s. If you wanted to lump China into this as well, when you know, prior basically to, you know, the takeoff that started the Chinese miracle, there was a large set of agricultural reforms that occurred in the late 1970s. So I think just if you're looking at the chronology of things, it does definitely you know, raise the question: does agricultural reform, does changing agricultural institutions have something to do basically with the takeoff of growth? Now, you mentioned, I think, the state capacity thing. I think that's really central to all of this. It's important to state, and this is, I guess, the way that history is interrelated, is that, you know, land reform is like this huge amorphous term. It means just you know, so many different things to different people. There were large numbers of land reform that had occurred, for instance, under Japanese rule, and I think this is started getting at the state penetration stuff that you're talking about, where, you know, if you mentioned James Scott, like in a lot of sort of developing countries, the state has actually very limited legibility or visibility into actually what conditions are on the ground. And so you need to do
Can I
things
give you
like,
a word here? Can I give you a
yeah,
word?
yeah.
So in Zambia, I lived on a swamp, and what they used to say is "Bale tulekelesha," which means they've abandoned us. Like there was literally no sign of the state. You know, sub-Saharan Africa has very low population density. We were
Mhm.
2 hours walk from the nearest clinic. We were 2 hours drive from the nearest police station. Like I would not know what the state looked like in that part of town.
Yeah, yeah. And I think part of that reflects, I think, longstanding historical differences, right? You mentioned the low population density, which I think is a historical feature of sub-Saharan Africa. But then also, you know, the Japanese did a lot of that work of modern state building, where they ran cadastral surveys. They figured out basically
Sorry, what's that? Cadastral survey?
cadastral surveys. Like a cadastre basically is just like, it's like a big register of who owns what plots of land. And
Okay.
so this is like the establishment basically of Western style property rights that are clearly delineated. You know, in most parts of the world, most like sort of pre-industrial parts of the world, you know, land rights are much more sort of complex than, you know, it's just, here's a clearly defined square that I own and I exclusively have rights over, right? Often, you know, land is communally owned. You know, there are a whole bunch of different systems across different places, and it's often it's very unclear basically who has exclusive sort of economic rights. And the Japanese basically impose the system firstly in their own country, but then also in the countries that they colonize. So Taiwan and South Korea, and Korea, I guess, as a whole. And so that, I guess, building on that institutional legacy is sort of what enables further stages of land reform. So what people typically think of when they talk about East Asian land reform, which is usually redistribution, right? So you actually need to know who owns what in order to be able to redistribute it. And so that's building on the land registers and the sort of administrative and institutional work that the Japanese had done. Now, there's a conventional view that's, I guess, most famously articulated by Joe Studwell in his book, How Asia Works, which is that land reform was this huge boon for agricultural productivity. So the standard story kind of goes that if you have smaller farms, so you redistribute larger estates, you break them up and you give them to the tenants who actually till the land, they have more of an incentive to work hard. Maybe smaller farms are more productive than larger farms. And so basically agricultural yields, agricultural productivity starts to go up. You generate the surplus. if you're a developing country and you want to industrialize, you need money. And what do you have to sell but agricultural production, right? And so boosting agricultural productivity allows you to import the machines and the capital, basically to get industrialization going. This was the conventional view, and actually, I think it was very much a state-sponsored view, where like I think the nationalist government in Taiwan, to a lesser extent, I guess the various Korean regimes, tried to emphasize land reform as this double boon. First, in that it reduced inequality. Look at what we gave all the peasants. We made your lives better off. We gave you a little bit of land. But then secondly, it's good for productivity. So, in economics, typically there's this trade-off between equity and efficiency. We get both. This is what a great thing that we did. You should support us, right? Now, I think at least part of the story is true. I think there's evidence, basically, that land reform did help. But my work in Taiwan and China shows that maybe the story is a little bit more complicated. I'll focus on Taiwan, I think, because that's like sort of top of mind, and it's typically held up, I think, amongst the Joe Studwell described it as the one to beat. Like in terms of the amount of land that is redistributed, in terms of, I guess, the social upheaval, this was like the most ambitious attempt to reshape agricultural institutions. And the Taiwanese experience, at least, was that yields went up by something like 40% in terms of rice yields throughout the 1950s. My research with Jianquan Wang at Penn State basically shows we digitized for the first time the actual sort of agricultural records at the township level from Taiwan. So nobody has really looked at this systematically, at least from this sort of cross-sectional statistical level. And what we basically find is, there's some evidence that one form of land reform, which was redistributing former Japanese-held lands, that boosted agricultural productivity to a significant degree. But the land reform that people mostly think about, which is this redistributionary form of land reform, where you break up larger estates and you give them out to the tenants, we actually find a statistical null on that. So we can't really detect any major effect of agricultural productivity, of land reform on agricultural productivity. And if we do the math actually on that first stage of land reform that I mentioned, which was this redistribution of Japanese public held lands, we also find that it just cannot explain the large increase in agricultural productivity that you saw throughout the 1950s and 60s. So something at least about the conventional story is kind of not quite right, which is that, it doesn't appear that agricultural productivity was boosted to a significant degree by land reform. And that point's potentially...
Wait. I want to say two things. One, your paper is great, but the entire time I was reading your paper, I had one thought on my mind, which you articulate in the last line. That what about the counterfactual? If you hadn't done land reform, there'd been a leftist insurgency, Maoist takeover, and then famines, right? And that's the point that you started with. But this was important for the legitimacy of the government. And even if the land reform didn't boost agricultural productivity in the way that an economist can detect through your very careful and granular methods, there may also be this important political effect that it had, stability, and then you can build a state. You can't do industrial policy if everyone's, doing leftist insurgencies.
That's right. I think that's the critical thing to highlight, which is that I think the conventional sort of maybe if you want to call it like narrow economic efficiency view is missing something very important, which is that these states probably would not have survived if they didn't do large scale land reform.
And they felt that. They knew that, as you articulate, yeah. Right? They'd just seen that. They'd just been chucked out of China. They saw that there were these leftist insurgency, and they were like, fuck, we better do something. The other thought that I had, and in your discussion, you say that, one of the reasons that maybe phase 3 of the land reform didn't work is because you had these tiny plots, right? Tiny plots, which are not so productive. You know what it made me think? And then you say, well, and this could have, you find this propelled women into manufacturing, leaving the farms because there's nothing to do. I think this might also help explain Bangladesh's relatively high rates of urbanization, because you've got massive population and some of those farm plots are relatively small, and so people have little choice but to go into the cities, and so you have this large labor supply for all those factories. A dispossessed proletariat, to use the sort of leftist parlance.
Yeah, I think the Bangladesh case is apt. I think there's a lot of research though the papers don't immediately jump to mind, that I think like land inheritance systems also kind of have this interaction, like where if you're essentially splitting up plots
Oh yes,
basically as
yes,
generations
yes,
go
yes,
down,
yes, yes,
you're
yes.
essentially expelling basically all this like surplus labor where people don't have any property rights to the
Yes,
land because they're the
primogeniture
second
or
son.
other systems.
Exactly.
Yes, yes. It's
Exactly.
all about
Yeah.
history. Is all about how you get rid of second sons.
Yeah. Exactly. Um, but so jumping back to the East Asian case, um, I mean, we have clear examples basically of regimes that essentially cease to exist. So like, there's almost like this evolutionary filter that's going on. I mean, South Korea comes perilously close to ceasing to exist. It gets invaded by the North. Um, that's not quite. That's more of a conventional war. But you know, I think there was more buy-in potentially in the northern
But that's something
population
I
in part.
wanted to ask you. Do you think, it's one thing for the ruling government to think, bugger, we better do this or we're screwed. But do you think those rural landlords were also sympathetic to having their land confiscated because they could be persuaded, yes, we'll confiscate your land, but this is the best way? Like, did the landlords see it as in their self interest? Like, could they be
Yeah, I
persuaded by the
actually
same?
I have a paper on this, which I have not released because it's a cute little paper and I haven't quite figured out what to do with it. I can share with you the draft and maybe I'll post it on my website, which is exactly this question, which is looking at South Vietnam, which is the example of kind of like that meme of like the plane with like the red dots on it
Oh,
that
yes,
kind of
yes,
illustrates
yes,
statistical
yes, yes,
selection. Like
yes,
this is the
yes.
plane that didn't come back, like with like the that got shut up on the nose, right? South Vietnam is the example that basically, at least for the longest time, failed to do an effective land reform. And basically, the state was completely hollowed out. You essentially had a rentier state that was where the government was essentially run by the landed elites. But very towards the very end of the Vietnam War, like right before the Saigon regime collapses, I think in '75, there is actually a large scale land reform, and there's actually very good data on this that I think Melissa Dell has actually largely collected. Um, Looking at the village level, the deployment of this land reform, but also looking at basically places where there are American troops and American troop deployments. There's because Robert McNamara was famously anal about data. There's incredibly good data on this, and so you can basically see in this little paper that I have that as American troops start to depart, you see little surges, I guess, of Viet Cong activity, of insurgent activity. Right as the American troops leave, the Americans are gone. They take their helicopters and all this stuff away. The South Vietnamese military is pretty inept, and so the Viet Cong come in, and you see upsurges basically in communist activity. But in these places where the Americans leave, insurgent activity goes up. You actually also see increases in the government-run land reform. So the South Vietnamese run land reform, and this I think is pointing to the decision that is being made by the local landlord, where basically they see our sort of protectors are gone. The people who are upholding what's essentially a very unpopular kind of regime that are upholding the current property distribution. They're leaving, and we don't no longer have any protection. I think there's a decent argument to be made that that's what causes their acquiescence basically to this reform. Part of it might also be that the Viet Cong take over control of the village and thus land reform is kind of a fait accompli, like they're just going to do it anyway. But I think there is a decent argument to be made that these landlords basically see the writing on the wall and they acquiesce to a reform which previously they would have co-opted. And that reform actually turns out to have, I think, pretty significant effects with the limited data that we have. Agricultural productivity seems to go up. It actually seems to be implemented, unlike prior reforms. But by then it's too late, and Vietnam has gone through 20 years of war. And when there's a conventional invasion from the north, that regime basically completely collapses. Anyway, that's a very long
Wait,
tangent, but I think
I will send you.
yeah,
I will send you a book that makes an exact parallel argument about Norway. So they argue that the Comintern, the Soviet Union meeting in 1918, people came from all over, including Norway's labor movement, and they got really excited by the communist Bolshevik revolution, and they started mobilizing right across Norway, and the elites got scared. They're like, "Oh, we're going to have a leftist takeover." So they first tried repression, they increased controls and surveillance. But when that wasn't working, they actually conceded. They conceded a shorter day, they conceded workings, and they conceded social democracy. So that is their argument about the formation of social democracy, that the elites are like, this is the only way in which we're going to hold on to power. let's give them some crumbs. Let's give the people a few crumbs, and they'll be happy. And of course, that interacts with pre-existing conditions like a cohesive, relatively egalitarian, whatever. But yes, so I'll send you some papers on that because there are parallel arguments.
I am very sympathetic to that. I think Sherry Berman has also made a lot of similar arguments about the formation of social democracy in Europe. And I think, this is again one of those things, and maybe this links back to the land reform stuff about the survival of these regimes. It's like it's essentially impossible to prove in the sort of standard causal and inferency kind of framework that I think is predominant in economics. But it feels like historically very persuasive that, when there was a genuine sort of threat of communist takeover, you need to kind of ameliorate conditions. You need to make concessions, and you need to make more progressive sort of policy decisions and take care of the needs of your people, because otherwise you might be the barbarians might be at the gates. So I'm sympathetic to these kinds of points of view. So that's I think that's the way to partly rescue land reform. I think as from a political perspective, I think it was necessary. And then also, if you're willing to take, I think, a broader view of the Joe Studwell thesis, and you kind of abstract from land reform, but think about agricultural policy more generally, because there were other sort of agricultural policies going on at the same time. There was a lot of American aid that was poured into Taiwan. There was increased fertilizer usage. There was technical development of new, sort of high yield varieties. These were spread through agricultural extension services. So that's, again, the state penetrating in the countryside. There were farmers associations that sort of, helped solve these collective action problems, that invested in infrastructure. So all these things are going on simultaneously. If you take a broader view of these things and say that basically state investment in agriculture and state focus on agriculture is like a developmental priority, there I think you can kind of rescue the Joe Studwell thesis and say that basically I think it is true that at least in Taiwan, Japan, maybe to a lesser extent Korea, that this sort of growth in agricultural productivity, which would not have been possible without the intervention of the state, enabled and set sort of the foundation for the takeoff and growth that was to follow.
May I pinpoint some of the mechanisms?
Sure.
So maybe let's think about 3 different mechanisms by which land reform and agricultural productivity might be important. So one is, are you familiar with Christabel Kay's argument? So Christabel Kay has a paper in Third World Quarterly where he argues that what was crucially important is the political consequences, that in Latin America, the rural landlords stayed very powerful and they blocked a number of reforms in order to prop up their own industries. Whereas by decimating the big, powerful landlords in East Asia, you enabled, the later thing that Peter Evans talks about, like embedded autonomy, being able to discipline, right? Because if you've got a more egalitarian class structure, you can, discipline businesses more. So one is that political capacity over the rest of society. I guess the other element is high agricultural productivity feeds into the Danny Roderick paper we discussed earlier, that food was relatively cheap. So your workers can be more internationally competitive because you don't have to pay such high living costs. So that could be one way in which agricultural productivity was really important for subsequent industrialization. And I guess the third element is just pushing people into the cities. Like where do you think agricultural product, or no, I guess maybe the third element is having cheap food was important for, or the agricultural productivity was important for creating the capital surplus, or no, another one of Studwell's argument is that higher agricultural productivity meant more money. So whether it's coming through land reform or whatever, agricultural productivity means higher income of rural farmers so they can buy bicycles. And then you can have endogenous processes of growth whereby a factory is making a bicycle and someone in the village is buying it. Like, could we just pin down for structural transformation, how do you think the agricultural productivity story fits in with a broader process of growth?
Can I be cheeky and propose a 5th one? And I
think, go for it.
I mean, the cheekiest answer is that there's elements of all 5
yes,
of these.
Yes.
The cheeky 5th one is I think this has been kind of underemphasized, and it's not brought out as prominently in Joe Studwell's book, in part because I think he assumes a very state-centric kind of view of development. This has been brought up a lot in Taiwan, also in mainland China, where basically kind of around the same time as the land reform, you see sort of formations of rural industrial clusters, rural industrialization. And the argument here basically is that as agricultural productivity increases, as yields go up, farmers actually are freed up in terms of their time. And so there's this long tradition and history throughout East Asia of local handicrafts, of local artisans, and farmers aren't just farmers, because in part, there's so many people, this competition is so fierce. Labor is incredibly productive, and so you have a lot of these rural handicrafts industries starting to form in the countryside. And I think there's some statistic that, like, even in like the early 70s in Taiwan, I think Samuel P.S. Ho has an article about this, that like around 50% of industrial value added was actually in rural districts, which is kind of crazy when you think about
Where's
it.
that? In South Korea?
In Taiwan.
Oh yeah, Taiwan. It was super high, super high.
Yeah, exactly.
All these little family industries. That was the key part. I mean, that was the key distinguishing factor, right?
Right.
South Korea and Japan had the chaebols. Taiwan had all these SMEs,
Small and medium
busy SMEs.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. And this is also true in China, in the Chinese case, where it appears that throughout the 80s and 90s, or at least maybe more the early 90s and the late 80s, one of the major sort of drivers of industrial growth, and really I think the most dynamic sector of the economy, were what were known as the township and village enterprises.
Yes.
The sort of legal and the precise administrative structure of these is a little confusing. They're called township and village enterprises because they were located in the countryside. Often these had sprung out of basically the rural enterprises and the rural brigades of the communist era. And so there is continuities there in terms of the state regime, but some of these were also private, and some of those distinctions are a little confusing. But broad brush, like there were the formation of these rural enterprises doing a lot of this light manufacturing for export. And who was supplying the labor to do this? It was the former peasants, basically.
Yes.
And I don't think there's direct evidence of this yet. I'm trying to work on it in an extension of my China paper. But I think there's good reason to believe that one thing that happened with the various land reforms that occurred in mainland China throughout the late 1970s, so things like the household responsibility system,
yes.
things like the reforms to procurement prices, these basically freed up labor time for peasants, and they were able to start to engage in these sideline activities, which turned out to be, in some sense, like the star of the show economically. And the township and village enterprises, at least throughout the 80s, were actually the major sort of driver of productivity growth. So yeah, that's another way I think that agricultural productivity growth can potentially impact industry.
Rural off-farm employment.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, all right, now let's go to some of the other policies, like industrial policies. I know you like my friend Nathan Lane's paper.
Yes, I'm a big fan of Nathan Lane's paper.
Nathan has been on this podcast twice.
Wow. Yeah, so I'm not sure I'll do as good a job as summarizing his idea as he did.
Everyone knows we can skip Nathan. So Nathan is great. We'll skip that.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, just like at a high level,
yes.
If you're not familiar, like the idea is that the East Asian countries were all famously engaged in industrial policy, which basically means that they were intervening in specific sectors. The state picked winners to a large extent. It's kind of interesting. Like, I think when I started my PhD and I was like, oh, I really wanted to do stuff in industrial policy, and I, explained this to my professors, like, some of them looked at me like I had like a third eye, like in my forehead.
Really?
Yeah. And it's amazing how, I mean, Nathan's paper was.
Why do you think that? Because they were like, because they doubted its efficacy, or they just thought it was a loser topic? Because this is something Nathan talks about a lot, that people treat it like it's a loser topic. So it's cool now. It's cool now.
It is very cool now.
It's cool now, but I think, yeah. So this is what, 6 years ago it was a loser topic.
Yeah, I think it was just out of fashion. I think there was a very strong body of academic evidence saying that this shouldn't work. To a large extent, there still is, mostly theoretical, I should add.
This is very important. Wait. Okay, so now I'm more interested in, I think coolness is very important, right? Yeah. We want to be cool. We want to do cutting edge topics. What was it about industrial policy that made it uncool? Because I think, for me as an academic, I would think, especially if that something is under research, especially if there hasn't been careful empirical methods, as Nathan, as others apply. So, based on your early conversations, what was it that made it uncool? Like, were we so neoliberal that we refused to see it?
It's a boring answer, but I think that's a large part of it. I think, it was just kind of outside of the Overton window of topics. I mean, that has completely transformed in the past 6 years. Like, now the policy environment is all about industrial policy. And
yes.
It's kind of now, I think the new consensus is that this is something that's worth doing. Yeah, but even 6 years
And
ago,
that is a
Nathan's
good
late. Yeah,
example. That is a good example of culture and how culture is malleable.
yeah,
Going back to
yeah,
our earlier
absolutely.
conversation.
And Nathan's paper, I think, was very lonely, like in that literature. Like I
Yeah, big
remember,
loser.
yeah, yeah, I remember trying to Google papers, like search on Google Scholar for papers about industrial policy, kind of in this modern sort of empirical framework. And I think Nathan's was the only one that came up, at least in this
Yes.
Asian industrial policy space. Then there was Ernest Liu's paper, and
Yes,
then
yes, yes. It's a great paper.
Rika Juhas's paper on like infant industry policy during the Napoleonic Wars
But
also
I
came
think
out
this,
roughly around
yes,
this time.
absolutely, absolutely. And Nathan discusses it in his nice review, The New Empirics of Industrial Policy. And I think this is such a great example of how academics all over the world may want to research a subject, but their advisors, sensibly want them to do well, and we may steer people away from uncool things, and that creates a self-perpetuating cycle where certain things just don't get explored.
Yeah, I think, but I will say that a lot of these people now are doing research in industrial policy, so it's not even like
No,
there
no,
was an
no, but
ideological disinclination,
no,
but
no, no. But I do
but
think it reflects a broader theme of conservatism and
yeah, I think in this case, actually, like actual economic policy in terms of what the United States is doing right now, with like the CHIPS Act and all this kind of stuff,
yes,
that actually led. I think academic research into this stuff actually tends to follow rather than lead. Right? You would think that like in the realm of ideas or something, like it's possible to imagine a different model where where academic research basically tries to set the agenda. And it's like, okay, here's like a cool new policy idea that you hadn't thought of, and maybe we should do things this way. To some extent, I guess Nathan's paper is kind of like that. But broadly, I think in part because of data needs, in part because you can only you can only do studies retrospectively about policies, and if you're kind of adopting a very causal inference heavy sort of
yes.
mindset, you need the data to exist, and so the policy has to have occurred. Um, but yeah, I take your point that I think, yeah, in general, there is a little bit of conservatism, I think, in terms of what topics can be studied. But now there's a thriving literature, so I think
Yes, yes. So now
things have
people are
corrected
fine. Now
themselves.
people are fine.
Yeah.
Okay, okay. Next bucket. Are we moving on to buckets? Are you done
Um,
with your policy bucket?
yeah. Let me just. I think the other thing that I would mention, I guess, is like the increase in human capital.
Yes.
Um, I think. I mean, we alluded to this earlier in terms of the cultural factors. Um, I'm a little bit more skeptical, I think, than the average economist, I guess, about the benefits, or I guess the how much of a role you want to attribute increases in education to East Asia's economic takeoff. Certainly, I think in a comparative global comparative setting, East Asia was an outlier. Um, but I think I guess the reason I'm skeptical is that since the '90s, I guess you've seen large increases in schooling and primary school
Oh,
attainment
no,
throughout
no,
the.
no,
No,
Oliver. Now we must part ways.
no,
I'm a
all
big
right,
shill for labor productivity because Justin Sandifer and others, and Pritchett of others, have showed that even when you have a big increase in learning, they find that in many parts of the world that literacy isn't improving. I actually spent 3 months just sitting in Zambian classrooms. I sat in 3 Zambian classrooms. Say if you have 6 hours, six classes in a day, a teacher only comes to 2. He or she does some rote learning on the board, writes things on and it's not learning. And in the
yeah,
times when teachers wouldn't come, I would set the kids essays and they would write essays for me and I would give them feedback and stuff. And the learning was really, really low, and it's a major struggle. And we can see this in international heterogeneity of the PISA scores, for example. East
right,
Asia absolutely tops all those PISA scores. And it's not just and it's and again, the cultural emphasis on education, like saying, "Oh, but did you hear what that son is doing?" and how much pressure. And obviously, there are downsides to this. Like when I stayed in, when I was staying in Hong Kong at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. I was staying in dorms. I couldn't open my window. Why could I not open my window? Because some people commit suicide. But it's that very, very intense struggle, that intense status competition that means people absolutely want to. I interviewed a woman from Taiwan, and she said that when she was at school in Taiwan, her placement in class, her chair was based on her ranking in class.
yeah.
So
my mom, I think, recalls that from going to school in Korea as well.
that is a serious emphasis on meritocracy. This is and I hear this in my interviews with people from Singapore. There's really, really strong reverence for merit, for education and for meritocracy, and that's why you have these very quantifiable exams rather than say like a written essay. So you have a very clear metric of how it gets marked, and you have this very strong system of learning. And people, in South Korea, going to these hagwons and study. It's normal for people to be studying up till 10 p.m. with their maths tutor, etc., etc., and people moving to different places to get the better math. No, I think one, I'd say that schooling is not a barometer for learning, and I think that shows up in literacy tests. Labor productivity is hugely important for technology adoption, and East Asia does phenomenally well in terms of education, not just in terms of topping the PISA scores, but you can see it in terms of hours spent on homework, etc., etc. An entire society all focused on education with upsides and downsides. So I would disagree.
I take all those points.
All right, you back down. You back down.
No. Let me give, I guess, the synthesis. Hopefully.
Okay.
Which is that I think I absolutely completely agree in terms of schooling is not learning. There's all this research, for instance, on this learning gap. You have all these children in sub-Saharan Africa and India who are, let's say, they're enrolled in year 5 of their education or whatever, and are only able to read at 2 years behind, or if they're able to read at all.
Yes.
And so, there's a lot of rote learning, but it is still true that there have been large increases, I think, in educational investment, and there have been increases in these test scores, I think, in some of these places. And it's not to the degree, basically, that you would hope, but it is true that this was at least a major sort of developmental priority. And I think what's missing, I think I completely take your point in terms of the you want an educated workforce. You need educated people to create ideas, to come up with new sort of entrepreneurial schemes. But education I view as like more of a complement, essentially, in that you can train people and you can give people an education. And I think education is worthwhile purely from a human rights standpoint. But from a sort of purely market standpoint, like there have to be opportunities awaiting these people at the end of the line when they graduate. And this is I think a huge problem in a lot of sub-Saharan African countries, where you actually have a large stock of pretty unemployed, fairly highly educated, even by global standards, people.
Absolutely. People can be very well educated but struggle to get jobs. But I do think that education is super important, not just for the innovation and entrepreneurship, but also for state capacity, right? Having brilliant, skilled people working out how to make strategic decisions, that's super, super important.
Yeah, I mean, there's this famous factoid, I think, about Congo. I'm going to probably get this wrong, but at independence,
yes.
I mean, the Belgians had done such a bad job during their colonial regime. I mean, this is one of the most atrocious
horrific
colonial regimes in history. But basically, there was only something like a double-digit number of high school graduates in the entire country.
Yes.
And there, it's understandable that it's very difficult to how do you run this whole administrative apparatus for a country that's as large as the Congo. I mean, that's incredibly difficult without people who are able to keep accounts, all this kind of stuff. And the stock of people is just too low. So I completely take that point.
Okay, I interrupted you. You were discussing, yes, you were. Okay, so now are we still in the bucket of policies, or are we moving on to the next bucket?
Yeah, let's move on, I guess, to the third sort of bucket of factors, which hopefully, I think, condenses everything and contextualizes everything.
Okay,
which is the sort of the global macro environment, by which I mean both sort of geopolitics, global prices, your factor endowment vis-a-vis these global prices. So these are things that are just kind of out of your control, and this is the context in which you come into. And as I've talked about frequently, I think that my personal take is that geopolitics is really central to this. So basically, all of the successful East Asian tigers, they were literally on the front lines of the Cold War. Almost every, for instance, they each have a mirror, right? South Korea has North Korea, Taiwan has mainland China. They had very clear examples of essentially threats to regime survival.
Yes.
And as I mentioned with the case of South Vietnam, you have real examples of states that basically failed when they were unable to get their act together, when they were unable to solve sort of the coordination problem of development and sort of delivering things to their citizens. They disappeared, and so they don't exist anymore. I think this is something that's basically completely impossible to prove. Using a strict sort of.
I'm with you. But look at Singapore. Singapore doesn't obviously have that same existential threat, does it?
Well, I mean, so there was,
Unless your counterfactual is just being engulfed by Malaysia.
yeah, I think that's a very valid counterfactual. I mean, there was, I mean, Lee Kuan Yew was hyper obsessed basically with a potential communist takeover in the late '60s, and there's this very famous example. I think this is probably the most egregious form of Singaporean authoritarianism. I was almost going to say totalitarianism, but I think that would get you in trouble. I think it's authoritarianism, where basically in the late '60s, Lee's People's Action Party was facing a lot of electoral competition with Barisan Sosialis, which was a pretty left wing Malay party, or I guess this was Barisan Sosialis is in Malay, but I guess at that time, sorry, I should correct myself. It's not a Malay party, but it's very much a working class party within the context of Singapore. And one thing that Lee Kuan Yew does as a sort of precondition for Singapore's merger with Malaysia, because the Malays are also kind of afraid of this socialist influence, is he throws all of the primary leaders in jail. And this is what enables the People's Action Party to return to power and win elections. And I think is kind of a...
But that said, you have communist struggles in Indonesia, you have leftist struggles in Turkey. There are lots of societies that have seen leftist struggles, right? The left exists everywhere.
Right.
In Latin America, there were a bunch of leftist insurgencies. And in fact, Kurt Wayland has a nice book on about how this actually encouraged people to support the authoritarians because they were terrified of the communists. But I'm just saying, I totally accept that geopolitics is important, existential survival is important. But there are many countries that had leftist movements, yet didn't see convergence with the West.
That's right. What I'll say, I guess, is the sort of variable that's missing is the extent to which you were able to kind of deal with your communist insurgency purely through means of force. So famously, in Indonesia, you had one of the worst sort of American-sponsored massacres in Cold War history. It's something somewhere like 500,000 to 1 million Indian communists, or even just innocent people, are just completely slaughtered. And so that kind of ensures regime survival without having to deal with with making economic concessions, let's say.
Yes.
Indonesia also is I think it's a very different kind of state, basically, than South Korea or Taiwan. It's much more heterogeneous. Indonesia is just a massive country. It stretches for thousands of miles. So, I mean, there's a lot of intervening factors here. I don't want to say that geopolitics is everything.
No.
But I do think people often pose this question. It's this is a very, I guess, high level abstract econ way of thinking about this. But how do you solve the coordination problem? You have all these sort of competing interest groups. At least in the East Asian case, you don't have different competing ethnic groups, but at least you have competing interest groups within society. You have different classes. How do you solve the problem that the elites just don't keep everything for themselves? And I think state survival is actually a huge part of that, where you literally have a neighbor that's waiting across the border that's ready to invade, and that's a credible threat, at least even into the 80s for South Korea.
Yeah, and Faisal Ahmed has a new book called Conquest and Rents, and he argues that one of the drivers of persistent authoritarianism is basically rents. So, for example, this may be in Qatar, that you've got NATO troops stationed there, or oil rents. So his 3 types of rents that he discusses are foreign aid, right? That ensures regime survival. Oil rents ensures regime survival through the sort of authoritarian social contract. We give you freebies and you recognize us as leaders. And also the NATO troops stationed all over, which ensure regime survival. So, I mean, I wouldn't say this, I would never say this, but it is possible that well-intentioned benign development actors are creating precisely the forces that reduce that existential fear, which was so important to propelling a developmental mindset in East Asia. But I would never say that.
I mean, I think I would say I'm sympathetic to at least part of that thesis. I mean, certainly a large form, people like to abstract away from aid, right? Or people like to just describe aid. Aid is good, aid is bad, but there's a lot of different categories of aid. And actually, if you look at the raw numbers throughout the latter half of the 20th century, a lot of that aid that the U.S. was giving was essentially military aid, right? That has very little to do with economic development. It does show up in aid budgets in places. And that's exactly the kind of thing that ensures regime survival.
Yeah, it reduces the thing that you think is paramount. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So yeah, that's the geopolitical side, and I think that's That explains, I think, in part some of these divergences between East Asia, Northeast Asia, and other parts of Southeast Asia, like for instance, like Thailand, like the Philippines, where they were kind of like a little bit set back from the frontier. By the time they had communist insurgencies in some cases, the frontiers of the Cold War had kind of stabilized, and there wasn't so much of a fear of regime change. And in part, I think this also explains some of the divergences with Latin America.
May I ask you about Thailand and Malaysia? I don't want to push you on topic. So I find Malaysia and Thailand quite interesting in terms of their industrial policy. Like, for example, I understand that Malaysia hasn't tried to do so much like technology extraction as China has, but instead, it allows a number of multinational companies. And you know what I find interesting? That even though there were lots of multinational companies, that hasn't seemed to lead to technology uptake. So there's a nice paper on China's industrial policy. It's called Quid Pro Quo. And they find that, one, that China forced a bunch of joint ventures on automobiles, but actually some of the drivers of technology adoption by local firms wasn't the forced joint venture per se, but rather this technology, these know-how and skills disseminated into the local environment. So as workers shift firms, China is hyper labor mobility. They take their skills with them, right? So you work in some, whatever GM, and then you work in some BYD, and you take all the know-how with you, right? And what I find interesting is that why isn't that happening in so much in Malaysia? Why don't we see so much domestic innovation, domestic firms? Like why do you think Thailand and Malaysia's industrial policy isn't seeing such high returns?
Yeah, I'm not an expert, but
Okay.
I'll give my hypothesis for Malaysia, and I think Malaysia experts will cry foul and explain why I'm wrong.
I'm going to Malaysia later this year, so I will ask them.
I grew up in Singapore, so I mean,
Okay.
I think the comparison between Singapore and Malaysia is always that Malaysia it's almost like Mexico to the United States. Like here's like a much poorer country on the border that is a source of cheap labor, etc. I think in a global context, Malaysia actually looks relatively good, right? Like GDP per capita is something like $30,000. Like it's pretty respectable across all these different sort of development indicators. I guess I'll venture a hypothesis, and people can tell me why that's wrong. I think in part what's going on with Malaysia is that there's a divergence. There's a divergence basically between the economic elites and the political elites, right? Where a lot of the sort of entrepreneurial talent in terms of people who are starting up enterprises and stuff, and maybe this relates to long-standing historical differences, are essentially Chinese Malaysians.
Yes.
Who are a minority within the country. They make up the majority in Singapore. But there's a system of political preferences and affirmative action essentially that kind of that I guess to some extent is suspicious of this minority.
Yes.
And, doesn't like them accumulating too much power.
Yes.
And I wonder if that sort of impacts economic policy. And
yes,
like you don't want all your major industrial champions that are run by an ethnic minority that you don't really like that much, or at least the majority of the population doesn't like. People can tell me if that's wrong, but I think that's at least to my ear, it sounds like maybe part of what's going on.
Which goes back to my point about the importance of ethnic homogeneity, right? So in Malaysia, you've got a Muslim Malay population, which I think has emphatically pushed for religious protections as a way of strengthening their ethnic identity, recognizing that they are mostly economically behind. So that is a very good example of how ethnic division feeds into economic population. And, for example, if you look at the latest round of voting in Malaysia, many of the young people were voting for the hardline Islamist party. So I think that really plays out, and it impedes democratizing pressures of accountability if you're siding with a party because of ethnicity and political ideas, etc. Anyway, all right, so let's park it there. We are together on that, and I appreciate the roundup. Okay. So now I wanted to ask you a question, which I think many people will want to learn from you. How do you think big data and computational tools have changed our understanding of structural transformation?
Yeah, I mean, I think the simple answer is that it's brought structural transformation back into I guess let's call it the mainstream academic discussion. So here's like a very, very crude history, I guess, of economic thought. Like if you read at least like the mainstream development literature from like, let's say the 90s and the 2000s, like structural transformation is really this kind of like marginal issue. I don't really know exactly why this is. Is it because of like the neoliberal turn? Is it like Washington consensus style allergy to like large scale redistribution or industrial policy meddling? or it's like this general sort of academic turn towards more theory driven kind of research. But like if you read, like even like think about like the most famous models from this period, like Romer style models, like often they don't have multiple sectors. They're thinking about growth at the frontier. They're not thinking about like transformation between different sectors, and so it's not even in the math to do this stuff. This didn't really change much in the 2010s with the initial wave of like this whole, the randomized control trial revolution, the credibility revolution, where again a lot of the focus was kind of at the micro level. And it was like the framing was very much more about like charity and like what NGOs and aid agencies can do. And as I mentioned, like when I started out in my PhD in 2018, there really weren't that many papers about structural transformation. But I think since like maybe less AI tools, but I guess this approach of trying to digitize large amounts of data, having large N, having a rich set of variables, trying to go into historical records and building, large data sets of what went on historically. I think there's been quite a bit of a renaissance in structural transformation.
So what you're saying is that AI tools and big data can help us tackle big questions and put like structural transformation back on the agenda.
I think that's happened. I think it kind of predates the AI stuff. I think a lot of the exciting AI stuff is kind of perspective, right? Like Melissa Dell seems to be
doing transformational stuff.
Yeah.
Right? To do large scale text and context extraction from all these historical documents. Right? She's a revolutionary.
Right. So that's I think down the line. I think in the contemporary period, maybe the past like 10 years, what's happened is that to do the sort of empirical work, the causal identification work that other economists find credible, you need a lot of sort of observations.
Yes.
And it was just like very difficult to do this, or to produce, for whatever reason, it was difficult to produce research throughout, like in the more sort of theoretical form and like these smaller sort of micro scale stuff. But the ability to digitize large reams of historical data to enlarge basically the space of outcomes that you can look to. So you're not just trying to, tease out things from national income statistics, right? That you can download from the UN website.
With more data, you can do a more granular analysis of large-scale transformation.
And you can look at transformation within countries, right?
Yes.
So you can look at townships within Taiwan, you can look at districts within India, and that kind of makes the sort of, within the sociology of science sort of standpoint, it makes this sort of work legible to other economists. So I think that's a huge part of it. That's
very cool. Do you think that there's anything else that's put structural transformation back on the map, or is big data the biggest thing?
I guess in part, like just economics catching up to developments in the real world. It's kind of interesting that as structural transformation has like emerged as a literature, it's kind of also emerged as like a developmental conundrum, right? Which is that, like, I mean, Danny Roderick has all this work that maybe the sort of traditional ladder or the escalator of structural transformation, like manufacturing growth, is just no longer possible.
Yeah.
And the sort of rapid economic growth that you saw in East Asia is just no longer a possibility for
I believe that.
Present-day developing countries. I'm increasingly sympathetic to it. Part of me like kind of wants to like, it's like railing against it a little bit, and that there has to be something that can be tried. But I think
the naivety of youth, Oliver.
Exactly.
No, I think East Asian countries got their timing right, so they developed at a time where they could piggyback on many of the technology that had already been developed, and they could just apply cheap, skilled labor, right? So, for example, contraceptives were already available, microwaves, radios, all those things. You could harness those. Boom. And at that time, their technology was right in such that their productivity of labor and low-end supply chains was still cheaper than the available automation, right? So 1,000 workers were cheaper and more productive and more efficient than whatever robots you could conjure. That is not true today. I was touring around a biscuit factory in Uzbekistan, and there were, a couple of workers. Everything was done by machines that could monitor everything, temperature. And it's better than workers because they're never late, they're never absent, there are never excuses, there are never disturbances, there are never any labor struggles. You've got total perfection, total control, and none of the human nuisance.
Right. So this, I guess I should mention in the third bucket of like these macro sort of factors. And it's like, your endowments and vis-a-vis like the global sort of marketplace, right? So, if you believe in export oriented growth, in theory, you have to like sell your stuff to somebody, right?
Yes.
And so what prices you face kind of matter a lot. And if you were like a developing country, like in the 19th century, it's not always been true that like manufacturing was sort of the pathway, right? Like, Argentina did very well because of a commodities boom that basically occurred throughout the 19th century, where it turns out that exporting cattle is actually like the gold mine industry at that time.
Yes.
And now this gets into like the Prebisch Singer kind of dependency theory kind of stuff, where that pattern sort of changes, where, in the 19th century, like terms of trade were good for commodities. Europe is industrializing, prices of industrial goods are falling relatively, but the factories are consuming all these raw materials. And so it's good to be exporting raw materials. That changes in the 20th century. The West gets richer. It starts to turn towards services. The West itself starts to demand these industrial goods. And so East Asia is like perfectly positioned. And as you mentioned, like you have this instance where you have high population density. So you have relatively low labor costs.
Yes.
And then maybe in part because of these educational legacies, maybe from the Japanese, maybe because of cultural factors, you have relatively high levels of educational attainment. And so you have a relatively skilled workforce, a relatively productive workforce that actually also happens to be very cheap. And this is just like a perfect recipe.
Wait, I need to interrupt on 2 points. Because it's not just high population density, because India and Bangladesh had that. You've got a high population density combined with the proclivity of women to work. Because female labor force participation is a major structural determinant of growth. And if men's honor depends on female seclusion such that women will not go to those textile factories, then your population density is effectively halved in terms of worker output. So that's another really important point about East Asia. Now I want to ask you about another industrial policy of South Korea, which I think it's under-examined.
All right.
Can you think what I'm going to say?
Are you going to ask about K-pop?
Yes. I can look on Netflix and see, it's not just K-pop, but also Korean films. If you look at Netflix and like Indonesia, what's trending everywhere, K-pop and K-dramas, it's like an amazing export. And isn't it, I think it's a fascinating thing if you've got low fertility, then you and your domestic consumption base is small and aging, export it. I was interviewing an old woman, a 70-year-old woman in Malaysia, and she says, yeah, I'm army, the BTS army,
BTS
right?
army.
Yeah, isn't that amazing? Like, isn't it a form of industrial policy?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on this stuff, but my understanding basically is that it is like a governmental priority.
Yes.
And as an industry, it's incredibly organized, right?
Yes.
Like there's all these stories basically that these boy bands, these groups are like carefully cultivated.
Yes.
Their images. It's like the 1950s studio system in Hollywood, right? I mean, at least I can't really comment on the economic side because it's still a little bit of a mystery to me.
But isn't it interesting that economists aren't looking at it? I haven't seen any studies on it. I haven't seen any economic studies. I haven't seen any cultural studies. But it's massive. In Jakarta last year, Blackpink had a 2-day concert. They sold out 120,000 tickets for 2 days. It's huge. Wow. It's huge. So, it's understudied. It's not cool.
Let me bring it back, and maybe it will be cool because this I think relates to the AI stuff that you mentioned, right? Which is like prospectively thinking about what big data, what deep learning, and different sort of forms of information can do. Like I think one thing that I really worry about, and especially because James Scott passed away recently, is like this notion of legibility, particularly when thinking about development. So everything that I talked about is kind of framed through the lens of the state. And the state is the thing that's like most legible, basically, to the social scientist or the historian. Like the state is the one that compiles administrative records.
Yes.
The state is the one that writes down the laws and says, okay, we're going to fund these firms. We're going to subsidize these capital industries. And so, even in the most basic sense, like the economic statistics reflect the political or institutional sort of framing of the state that's like literally writing this stuff down. I think like the stuff that Melissa Dell is doing, these broader sort of digitization projects of newspapers and other forms of unstructured data, is potentially a way of starting to break out of that, right? Where you don't necessarily have to rely on the intermediary of the state recording things, and you can start to identify economic phenomena, maybe through things like other forms of media, like music and movies and TV shows.
Yes.
And I think that's going to potentially be a huge area that allows us to break out of the confines of, I think, what is an important but I think relatively narrow way of
That's a
thinking,
really interesting
centering the
point.
state.
That's such a
Yeah.
great point, that because so much has been written down by states, we have a very state-centric. Earlier this year, I wrote a very Substack on a wonderful paper on Hollywood blacklist and the influence of McCarthyism, and it's a
Mm.
really nice paper. And they find that when people were fearing persecution, they made fewer progressive films, and that had a long-run impact on cultural attitudes around America, and then also an impact on political voting. So I'm a big fan looking at the impact of culture. Yes.
So that I think is the hope. I think there's a lot that's still kind of buried. I think in part, like the research that I've tried to do in terms of digitizing records, in terms of satellite imagery, is starting to break out of that. But that's just like kind of the tip of the
Kenya,
iceberg.
right?
The China stuff I was thinking of, actually, like not having to rely on basically the government statistics, particular with communist China. You worry about these things being manipulated.
Yeah.
But if you can literally see the agricultural output on the ground, right, like that in itself is a huge unlocking of knowledge and unlocks new possibilities in terms of research.
So can I tell you a really depressing, sad thought that I had today? And
Sure.
I don't want to end the podcast on this note. So, for example, today, The Economist had an important coverage of the horrific war in Sudan. And they showed, with satellite imagery, you can detect how parts of El Fasher have the burning of buildings, right? So you can detect all this heat scarring on buildings, and you can show that you can track the war in real time. And it's such it's such a display of the differences that the West has this advanced technology that we can track the war in real time using this satellite imagery to see how these houses are being burnt down, but we don't have the tools to do anything about it. That having all this technology enables us to see that, and this is something I'm always struck with in study and development, that, our advanced technology enables us to finesse our learning, to see things at a very granular level, but we are still struck by our ignorance and our inability to actually solve many of these questions. I just found that very, very salient as I was reading this, tech-heavy, reporting on Sudan.
Yeah, I don't think that's the worst note to end on, in that it encourages humility, I guess.
Yes, it should. It should, right? We have this amazing data, we have this amazing technology, but the puzzle of how to generate and support structural transformation in an age when it's harder than ever because of that automation, that puzzle is still with us.
I think that's a good note to end on.
Dr. Oliver Kim, this has been a delight, a pleasure, and an honor, and I wish you great, great successes at Open Phil, who benefits so much from your wisdom.
Thank you so much, Alice. This was a lot of fun.
All right, you take care. Bye.
All right, you too. Bye-bye.